Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording. I appreciate you watching. So today we're going to talk about jQuery. And it's a bit of a funny thing that we talk about jQuery here. And I'll kind of tell you more about why we do that as we're getting started here, why we kind of work in jQuery and use this as kind of a jumping off point for getting started with JavaScript frameworks. So at this point, you have or you should have some familiarity with JavaScript, or you know how JavaScript works, kind of what JavaScript is. We'll do a little bit of a refresher on that here in a few minutes if you don't quite remember what it's all about. But what we're looking at when we talk about jQuery is something called a framework. So when I develop a framework, I'm basically developing another language, or what's kind of like another language that relies on a bigger, more complex language to be able to use it or to be able to run it. Right, so when I'm talking about jQuery here, it is JavaScript, and we'll use .js files for JavaScript when we're using jQuery. But it's designed to kind of make JavaScript a little bit easier, to make it a little bit more developer friendly, or a little bit more friendly for people who don't normally write a lot of code. Right, and a lot of people find just using regular JavaScript better, right? Because if you're used to using regular JavaScript, you know what you're doing. And it'll also, since it doesn't use a library that it has to make calls to in order to be able to run, just regular JavaScript's a whole lot faster. So at the core of it, when it comes to something like jQuery, ease of use is kind of the goal there. Now, one of the big things I want to go ahead and talk about right up front here is the idea that jQuery is really not used much anymore in new projects. Now, I did put emphasis there on new projects, because there are plenty of old projects that use jQuery, that still use jQuery. As of the end of last year, in a survey that was done by the World Wide Web Technology Surveys, 94.5% of web pages whose JavaScript library or JavaScript framework was known used jQuery. And it comprises, or it is used in 77% roughly of all web pages, according to W3 Techs. Right, and so these are huge numbers, right? And so when I say that jQuery is not really used anymore in new projects, it's kind of been replaced by different things. TypeScript, people just using regular JavaScript, other bigger frameworks that we see nowadays like React and Vue and Angular. But those numbers from W3 Techs, I mean, they don't lie, right? Like, you can look at a tech stack and see what it uses. You can basically just look at the head of a website and see that it uses jQuery. Or look in the body of a website and see that it uses jQuery. So this is something that we could learn, that we could figure out, and a lot of older websites still use jQuery. And if you get a job as a web development tech, you know, if you're going to be a webmaster somewhere or be a web developer somewhere, the degree of likelihood that you're going to be given a website where jQuery exists on it, that you're going to have to manage and maintain, is pretty high. Right? And you're not going to want to rewrite the whole code base from scratch. That's kind of ridiculous. But you would want to know the jQuery that you're looking at, what it is, how it's used, and that sort of thing. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about jQuery for a little bit. I probably won't take the whole hour today. I might. It just depends on how long it takes. We're going to talk about jQuery for a little bit. I'm going to show you a little example of using jQuery. And that'll be kind of all we do for today. Now, what I plan on us doing next week in the live class is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be something that perhaps you are not accustomed to hearing or seeing instructors do. Since I don't, since it doesn't really bother me if you know JavaScript or know jQuery rather very well or not, I think we should maybe look at some other tools next week that will help us out in making sure that we're doing things right when we're using jQuery. That'll help us out a little bit more than what we might be able to do just reading the documentation. Before today, we're going to kind of talk about jQuery, give ourselves a little bit of a backstory, do a little bit of a demo. We'll save all that for next week. So what exactly is jQuery, right? And we kind of said that it's, this antiquated framework that people don't really use much nowadays, but it's in new projects, but it's still on a bunch of websites. You get it from jQuery.com. We'll visit jQuery.com here in just a few moments. And it's basically just a huge library of predefined JavaScript objects and predefined JavaScript functions that are somebody else already wrote for you and they're free to use. And so the idea here is that it's way easier to use than just writing regular JavaScript, right? It's supposed to be a lot nicer, a lot friendlier to you. And the big thing that jQuery makes a lot easier is the sort of core of JavaScript, which is DOM traversal. Now, this will be a little bit of a review for some of you who may not have talked about JavaScript in a while, the idea of the DOM, or the Document Object Model. And so, as we've been building websites, like one of the things that you've seen is like, we put these tags in there, we put classes in there, we put IDs in there, right? For those of you who remember everything with HTML, right? We have 3 levels of specificity in HTML. We have tag selectors, or we have 3 levels of selectors in HTML and CSS. We have tag selectors, we have class selectors, and we have ID selectors. And those go from least specific to most specific in terms of what we're selecting, right? So if it's a tag selector, anything with that tag, like P for paragraph, H1, A, header, main, footer, whatever, whatever has that tag on your web page is going to have that tag name in the document object model. Classes are something that we add with the class equals attribute. So if you'll remember back to Web 115 or CTI 110, when we talked about classes and we said class equals, and in quotes we put a class name, and we said that class name could go on as many different elements that we want to put it on. So if we wanted to say have a green background on several different paragraphs, we could add a class equals green to the opening tag of a lot of our paragraphs, or whatever paragraph that we wanted to have a green background. And then finally, the ID selector, that ID equals, and give it some kind of name. That is for one specific item. So if we want to select one specific item, we can do that. And all of these things have different relationships to one another based on the DOM. And so when we talk about the DOM and we talk about traversing the DOM, we basically talk about the logical structure of the way that our HTML is laid out, right? So I might have a main that inside of that has several paragraphs, that inside of one of those paragraphs has a link, right? It sort of develops this family tree, right? And when we talk about the DOM, oftentimes we talk about things in terms of family trees. So I say tags have parents, and I say tags have children, and they're the relatives of one another. And so what JavaScript allows us to do is it allows us to look up and down this family tree to find specific things, and then perform interactions based on these different things based on events, right? And if you'll remember back, an event is just an action, right? So a button being clicked, something being hovered over, an amount of time passing, just some sort of action. Right, and so we say it looks like a tree, and here's an example of what we kind of see there. Right, we see here at the top we have a table. Inside of that table there are several rows, or in this instance there's one row. Inside of, then we have 2 TR tags, 2 TD tags for each TR, and then in each of these TDs we have data. Right, so we can kind of see here that this TD tag is connected to this table, but in order to get to this TD tag from this table, we have to follow a really specific path. And that's the DOM, right? Is the ability to get me from here to here, so that I can do things with this. Right, so as we're traversing the DOM, some things to think about here. JavaScript, and by proxy jQuery, it allows us to move through the DOM, and we can basically use this to find HTML elements based on their relation to other elements. So you can make one selection and move through that selection until you reach the elements that you desire. Then you can trigger things based on events for these elements. Right, so pretty cool. So as we are using jQuery in our pages, we first have to be able to include it in our pages, right? This is one of the biggest things. This is something that people forget oftentimes, right? Is that if you write jQuery, you have to include the reference to the jQuery library in your website somewhere. Right now, what's happened here, right? We see this first line. This is one option for you to include jQuery in your page, and that's to download it and host it on your own server or host it in your own GitHub. I don't recommend you guys do it that way, right? I recommend you guys use the other option to reference a CDN or content delivery network version of jQuery. And the one that you see here is an old one. We'll look at the most up-to-date one here in just a few moments. But it's from jQuery. And so I'll show you where to get this now on the jQuery site. So let's head over to jQuery.com. I already have it pulled up for us here, jQuery.com. This is what the website looks like. We can see that the current version of jQuery is 3.7.1. 3.7.1, so you could tell that that one from the slide that was like 1.4.2 was pretty old. Right, but that also goes to show us kind of how long this has been around, right? Like this has been around for the better part of 15 years now, maybe even more. And so if you look through here, it gives you a little bit of a tutorial regarding DOM traversal and manipulation here, because that's the core of what jQuery is. Shows you some pretty simple stuff that we can do. With jQuery. So it shows you jQuery DOM traversal here via this button example here. And it shows you another example here of event handling. Now, if I were to write this one line of code here in regular JavaScript, it'd look a little something like this, right? The first thing that I would have to do is I would have to document.query selector. Then I find my button. So in this case, since I use query selector instead of get element by ID, I can use button.continue here as well, the same way that I did. .inner HTML equals next step. So this one line right here in jQuery, that's just $ parentheses button.continue .html parentheses next step. If I were to write that in regular old JavaScript, it would look more like this. So you can see there, right, that what I'm saying when it comes to simplifying JavaScript a little bit is true here, right? Like there's some things that'll make it a little more complicated. There's some things that are going to make it a little more simple. The things that make it a little more complicated, basically make it that way because you're not used to doing it. Right, and we'll look at event handling a little more later. But getting back to including it in our project, I'm going to go here to download. Now, I'm not going to download it, right? But I'm going to go here to download because that's going to have the link to my CDN in it. I go here. Now you see here I can download it. And it's going to let me download the full version of jQuery 3.7.1. But what I'd rather do is I'd rather go all the way down here. And nowadays, like the modern way of doing it, if you wanted to download it, would be this right here. If you have Node installed on your machine, which is more of a modern way, you'd run npm install jQuery. I almost want to do this in this project just to show you all, and then get rid of it. So let's try that. Because I already have Node.js installed on my machine, which is what you'd need for running npm. Because I do a lot of projects in React and things of that nature. So you would need to download and install Node.js and npm. If you wanted to do things this way, again, I don't recommend you do things. But I would just run a simple command that was npm I jQuery. And I think I could do jQuery at latest to make sure I get the most up-to-date one. And you can see that it's added node modules here, and inside of the node modules is jQuery, and it's got the full jQuery source files in here. So you can see all these files here. It's a bunch of files. There are a bunch of different things. Like this is what's going on the back end when you're using jQuery. It's referencing all of these files that are in the download that have a bunch of code already written in it. It's a bunch of JavaScript that already exists. You're looking at a lot of this and you're probably super confused as it flies past your screen. You don't have to know what's going on here. And that's why using jQuery is so cool. All right, so it's good to do this to show you npm and just doing a quick npm run there, but it's also pretty cool to show you what's going on the back end. You can see there are a whole bunch of files here. Folders within folders within folders. I'm going to get rid of all of these. I'm going to delete them because I'm not going to use them. Let's get them out of there. I'm just going to use this one HTML file. And at jQuery.com, I'm going to keep scrolling down the page. So I'm on that download page. I'm going to keep scrolling down the page until I reach the jQuery CDNs. And this is what I'm going to use. I'm either going to use the jQuery CDN, which is the big link here. And so I could use that to go to this website and copy this. Typically, I recommend the minified link. So again, you'd click on the big link here, jQuery CDN. That takes you to the releases.jQuery.com website. Find 3.7.1 here, click minified. This is what you'd copy. So copy that to your clipboard. If you would rather use one from a different source, like say Google, here's Google's version of jQuery. It's the same thing. It's just hosted at a different place. Microsoft has it here. Again, same thing. Hosted at a different place. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to just paste that at the bottom of my body, right before the closing body tab. And so that's going to include all of these files into the project. You don't have to download them. You don't have to host them. In fact, doing it this way can be a little better sometimes right? Because if your users have gone to other websites that have this version of jQuery hosted from this site, hosted from code.jquery.com, then they'd already have it cached, so they wouldn't have to re-download it. Now, we're talking about saving them milliseconds, right? But it's still time that, you know, your site is loaded. So I need that. I'm also going to need a link to my JavaScript site. So I'm going to create a new set of script tags here at the bottom. And I'm going to point that to the source of script.js. Close that tag off there. And so now I can create my script.js file. So I'll go here to my new file button, type in a script.js. And so now my computer knows when it goes to load this website that it needs to first go to try to load this code here for jQuery, and then go try to load the custom code that I'm writing. And this is key. This is something a lot of people forget, because if I have it try to load my custom code before it loads the CDN, it doesn't know what I'm talking about, because it doesn't know I'm writing in jQuery yet. It's looking for a language that it knows, like regular old JavaScript. So if it doesn't know, hey, you're supposed to be writing, you're supposed to be looking for jQuery here, it'll throw you all kind of goofy errors. I'm also going to throw a link to a style sheet here really quickly. This is not a requirement here, but it's going to help us out for this demonstration. Link rel equals style sheet. Type equals text / CSS. And href equals style.css. Right, I'll make my style.css here. So now we have that style.css file. So now it knows to go look for this style.css file. It knows that I'm using jQuery, and it knows where to go to look for my JavaScript. Now, in order to be able to traverse the DOM, I need to have a DOM for it to traverse. So I need to have some sort of object in here for it to be able to look at. So I'm going to create a section here. I'm going to give that section an ID of, say, example. And we're going to close that off. And if we're going to talk about the DOM, right, we're going to talk about parents and we're going to talk about children, we should give this a child. So let's put a paragraph in here and just put something like hover over me. Right there like that. So now we have a parent section that has a child paragraph. And so we can traverse things in the DOM pretty easily this way. Right, so one of the things I'm going to want to do here is if I want my site to look some sort of way, I need to do my base styling first. So I can do custom styling in my JavaScript with my jQuery now, but I should do some sort of base styling here just so we know what it looks like. I'm going to start with my reset code. I'm going to set margin 0. I'm going to set padding 0. We'll do box sizing, border box. And we'll do font family sans serif. Right, just really simple, kind of reset code there, right? Don't do any margin, don't do any padding. Let me decide that all on my own. Do border box sizing so I can break the box model. Put a sans serif font on everything. And let's add our example item in here. Let's give it a background color. We'll just use the background shorthand. Now notice I'm using hashtag example here. Remember that hashtag in CSS constitutes an ID. We use the ID here in HTML. ID example. The hashtag example here is looking for that item. Let's make it orange. So that's going to be 2 times red than green, right? In sort of a Halloween mood, you know, first day of October. So we'd do something like FF7700. That's a nice orange. Let's give this a width of, say, 40%. We'll give it an aspect ratio instead of a height. So let's say this is a perfect square, so we'll give it a 1-to-1 aspect ratio. And we'll leave everything else sort of regular, right? So we can save this. And we can go over here and we can open our live server. And once our page opens up, we see it looks like, right, big orange square, little hover over me text here. We're going to change a lot of this with jQuery here in a few moments. Because like one of the things that we might want to do is select this paragraph. So one of the interesting things that we can do in jQuery is use like the children selectors to select these things directly, which is kind of fun. Now, one of the things that I want to do here is I want to write a little bit of code that will basically just tell this to load when the page loads, right? So if I were to do this in regular JavaScript, I would write something like document dot add event listener DOM content, quote, DOM content loaded, and then whatever function that I'm writing, put the name of that function in there, and then it knows to run whenever the page loads. In jQuery, we do something a little bit different that I think is a little bit easier to understand. I say $ parentheses document dot ready. And that just basically says when the document is ready. So when the DOM content is loaded. When the DOM content is loaded, I can do this function. So again, that's what it looks like in jQuery. If I were writing this in regular old JavaScript, I would be adding an event listener that goes DOM content loaded. And then we add the function name here, whatever we called the function that we're running. And we do this at the end, but in jQuery, we do the document.ready, and then we put the function inside of it. And technically we could, right? Because it is JavaScript. I could just, instead of writing a function here, inside of this, I could just write a function. That's like, you know, we'll do a little arrow notation function, so something like const change bg equals arrow notation document dot query selector body dot style dot background color equals 3. Right? And then I just call that function inside. It would be change bg like so. Maybe I don't. Actually, I think I might still have to write that. I think I have to write that. Let's add that back. There. And so I can write it like that, right? And that's going to make it work, right? That's green. Which works just fine, but you know, that probably is a little bit confusing. So we'd rather just stick to pure jQuery since that's what we're learning here. But I will show you what that looks like if we were to do that directly in jQuery. Right, so instead of doing all of this, what I would do is I would focus the body selector, like so. I would use the .css function and change the background dash color, just like I would in CSS, right, to some color. So let's do blue this time instead of green, so you can see the difference. And I'll put the call to the regular JavaScript function here in comments, so you can kind of see it there. And if you download the GitHub repo later on and play with it, you can kind of change back and forth. Right, but if we do that, we can see the site is now blue background, right? Same site. So this is how we do that in regular JavaScript. This is how we do that in jQuery. Pretty simple. Now, let's say I was going to focus that paragraph that's inside of our example. So in order to do this, let's go down here. I do $, right? I always start with the $, whenever I'm going to put any DOM element in here. $, hashtag example. Because I know, you know, I might know the example name. I might want to just use one paragraph out of here if it has multiple paragraphs, or I might just want to use the first paragraph. Something. So I'm going to select that paragraph, and we're going to traverse the DOM from the parent to the child. So example dot children. I want it to look for paragraph children. And then I'm going to want the first one, so I'm going to put it at the 0th index location, right? Because what this part does, right, is it creates an array of every paragraph inside of our example ID element. And so if I want the first one, I select the 0 index location. That's going to be the first one. Now, a smart thing for me to do here might be to make this a variable, right? So I might say something like let para equal. So then if I want to make changes to it, I don't have to refer to that whole thing again. I can make multiple changes by just doing something like para.css font dash size 36 pixels. Right, something like that. I believe this should. Let me comment this out just to make sure this is working before I might have just not made it big enough here. Because I am just kind of flying. Air.css. That should work. See what happens. That should work. I am just kind of spitballing this demonstration today. Interesting. Maybe they've updated the syntax just a little bit for children. So this would be a good use case for when we would use the documentation for jQuery here. And this is one of the things that we would do, right? When we're using any framework, is that we would use the documentation. We'd learn how to read the documentation. So I encourage you all to look at the API documentation for jQuery. In this case, we're going to look for the children function here. Here it is. Get the children of each element in the set of matched element, optionally filtered by a selector. And so we can read here, given a jQuery object that represents a set of DOM elements, the .children method allows us to search through the children of these elements in the DOM tree and construct a new jQuery object from the matched element. So in this case, we're looking at level 2, UL level 2. So we're looking at our level 2, and we're finding the children.css and making background color red. So we're looking for all the children of level 2. So that should make this list item red. Which they don't have a demo for that, or they don't have a live version. But it says here the result of this call is a red background behind items A, B, and C, right? Because we missed that one's also a child of level 2, but it was down here below this third level nested list. So we missed that one. That's what that is. So that would work the way that we would think it would work. So let's see what happens if we just take out that selection. See what happens now. Still not doing what it's supposed to do here. Interesting. Let's keep looking at our documentation. Maybe we missed something. See, let's take out this reference here to the index location. Okay. So when we take out the reference to the index location, it worked. I was pretty sure that that did an array, but maybe it doesn't anymore. Let's see what our documentation says. Doesn't really say anything about it. Right, so in this instance, one thing that we could do is we could call a console log. So I could console.log this part, and it'll tell me the data in the console that that's supposed to be, right? So I can save that. And now when we look in the console of the website, so I go down here to inspect element, I can see I get object here with a 0 index array. I see an array object with 0p. So that must be something that they've changed. In terms of how you access that in jQuery, which is kind of interesting. Because definitely the old way that you used to do that would be by using square bracket. But it's interesting why it's not working for the purpose of our demo. Let's see what it would do if I put another paragraph in here. So we can see by default, it's doing it to all children. So that second paragraph is also a child, and it's also 36 points. 36 pixels. Now if I take and make this a index location 0 here, it breaks. Interesting. Interesting. Let's try adding a P here just to make sure that that doesn't have anything to do with it. Interesting. That could definitely be something that was changed in the API. Because now, I mean, if we look here in the inspect element, I left that console log in. We can see it's telling me it's not a function. So it's not working with that in there. If I remove that, I get my jQuery object with 0 and 1 in it. Which means I should be able to reference that object. Interesting. Interesting. Now, one thing that I could do here would be to use an nth of type or a first child. Because these tags here inside of the parentheses work just like they would in HTML. So if I used a first child pseudo selector here, that should take care of the role that we wanted to do there. Which you see here that it does. That first child's big, second child's Okay. Interesting. And the documentation doesn't really say anything about it. Well, let's do a quick event function here, and we'll talk more about this later. But let's do a little quick event function here just to change the background color of this box, and we'll do it with a simple hover action. So if I were doing this in regular JavaScript, I would write two functions. I'd write like change box and set it to a specific function. Then I'd add another function that was be a change back, and then I'd add two different event listeners, because a hover event is actually two events. It's a mouse enter and a mouse leave. So if I wanted to change the background of this box using jQuery, first thing I would do is I would select the box, which in this case is hashtag example, right? So I can use $ hashtag example. And I can add a .hover function to it. Now remember, a .hover function is actually two functions. It's a mouse enter and a mouse leave. So I'll actually need to write two functions as a part of this. Right, so I will put parentheses here. And inside of here, I will write my first function using the function keyword like so. And so since I'm already inside of the example element, and I want to change something of that example element, I can use the keyword here, this. When I use the this keyword here, that's going to refer back to the element that we are inside. Makes that a lot easier. This. So this .css background dash color. Let's make it something. Let's make it like a light pink. So let's make it like a hashtag FF CCCC. Right, that way it'll stand out. Right, and so that's our first function. Then we'd have to add a second function for it to change back. So I'd find this curly brace here that goes with this function. Put a comma after it. Write another function. $ this, or $ parentheses this, dot CSS background color, and change it back. So it was FF7700. Since we've already done this, right, we don't have to add another event listener or anything like that to it. We can just call it done here, right? Because it's going to start doing this when the document is ready. Now if I pull this over, hover over, you see it changes color to the light pink. And when I hover off, it changes back. Now, if I wanted to, I could do multiple things, right? If you're going to do multiple CSS elements in one item, you do have to kind of change the way you format the CSS. So you actually format it more like you would CSS in a CSS file. So if I'm going to do more than one, I put curly braces inside of my parentheses here. And add my elements, background, color, colon. Or colon actually goes on the outside of the parentheses. We'll do that same color, that FF CCCC. Then we do a comma, and let's say just color. Red. Something like that, right? So that's how you would do multiple CSS elements inside of one CSS tag here. And copy and paste that here, just change those colors back. So I would change it back to FF 7700 and black. That. Go to our site. See the example. Hover over it. We see both colors change. Hover back. Pretty responsive. Next week, again, we'll do an example doing something even different that might help things out a whole lot for you all. So make sure you watch next week's. But that's all that I have for today. So while I'm waiting for questions here, I'll go ahead and go through just pushing this to GitHub again. So let me go ahead and come over here and go to my GitHub and look at my repositories. And while I'm doing this, you can be preparing questions. If you've got any questions, if you're watching the recording and you have a question, please send me an email or a Teams message. Let me know. I'm going to create a new repo. We're going to call this 2024 FA Web 140 JQ1. We're going to create that repository. Then back in VS Code, I'm going to open a new terminal. I'm going to get init. I'm going to get add period. I'm going to get commit -m, put my initial commit message in here. And now from here, I would follow the instructions on my GitHub. I would change the name of my branch. Add my remote location. And then push my branch to my remote location. Get push origin, push to origin from main. So that's get push origin main. And boom, there it goes. Now on GitHub, we'll check it out. We'll refresh this page, see that code is up. So we'll give you this link. We'll also make a GitHub pages. So I'll go to settings, pages, select my main branch and save, which will make my live site here shortly. And so seeing no questions, that is all I have for you for today. If you think of any questions later on, please send me an email or a Teams message and let me know. That's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.